For the first time ever, we're inviting you to join us on one of our adventures. And what better place to start than one of my favourite destinations, Portugal. But we're not just going for the beaches and the wine, we're following in the footsteps of one of history's most enigmatic organisations, the Knights Templar. That's right, we're going on the Trail of the Templars in Portugal. Over 5 days and 4 nights, we'll guide you from the winding streets of Lisbon to the hilltop castle of Almirol, the sacred halls of Tamar's Convent of Christ, and the enchanting, esoteric grottos of Quinta de Reguleira, the very place that inspired my book, The Templar Enigma. Now, this is no big group tour. There are just 6 spots available, and at the time of recording, only 2 remaining. If you want to secure one of them, head to lukerichardsonauthor.com/Templar tour right now. lukerichardsonauthor.com/Templar tour. We all know the story. It's one of the oldest of all time. The first woman ever created, opening a jar and releasing evil spirits into the world. That's Pandora, and her famous box, or jar depending on which translation you read, forms the basis of so much of what we think about ancient Greek mythology. But what if the story is something far more ancient, or something far more mysterious than we've been led to believe? Perhaps today we'll find out. Hey, I'm Luke. I'm an author of archaeological adventure novels. I travelled the world looking for stories to put into my books and share with you right here on the Adventure Story podcast. Now, just quickly before we dive in, if you would like some more adventure in your life, I would love to welcome you inside the Adventure Society. This weekly newsletter is your ticket to travel with me, to share my real-world adventures, and to find out first when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. There's a link in the show notes to join right now. James Richardson joins me today. He's the author of the Jackson Rain Archaeological Adventure series, set in the late 1930s and following a wise-cracking New York private investigator who has a habit of stumbling into the world's most dangerous ancient mysteries. His latest book, The Olympus Vendetta, sees Jackson Rain going head-to-head with Nazis, inquisitors, and forces far older and stranger than either, all in a race to uncover a lost Greek legend that may have been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. It's great fun, and today we're going to go behind the scenes and talk about the legend, unpack the legends just a little bit. James, welcome back to the Adventure Story podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me back. It's great to be here.
It is, yeah. I always enjoy talking about your books. And this one, this is the sort of conversation that I imagine this podcast being part of, because we're sort of peeling back the story a little bit and going into the history behind it, or what we understand of that. So we all know the legend of Pandora, or we all sort of think we know it, don't we? But the real myth is more interesting than that. What's it about?
We generally use the expression like Pandora's box quite colloquially, like all the time now. You sort of say, you're going to open a Pandora's box by doing that. Yeah. And it's a warning that if you do something, bad things are going to happen. But before going any further, just to sort of highlight for the you realists out there, that Pandora never actually opened a box. The earliest known texts about her were written by Hesiod about 700 BC. And the word he used is piphos, which is actually a massive earthenware storage jar used for wine and oil and grain, that sort of stuff. But a translation error in the 16th century saw it turn from a jar into a small box, and that's the image that's stuck in popular culture ever since. But the actual myth isn't just about this obscure figure, Pandora, who ancient storytellers like Hesiod plucked out of their heads to explain why evil exists. And she's often portrayed as this rather sort of dappy figure by our standards, who just sort of simply didn't do as she was told, opened the lid on a magical jar, and out popped strife and disease and sorrow and death. But I kind of think Pandora's the original concept of a genetically engineered biological weapon in some ways, that she was created specifically to punish mankind, not humanity at the time, but mankind, because Greek mythology consists of 5 ages. You've got the Golden Age, Silver, Bronze, Heroic Age, and then the Iron Age, which is when the Pandora myth was first sort of written, or first appears anyway. And it's arguably the age that we still live in, where us as mere humans, we have to work hard, we have to toil, we have to deal with misery and strife and death and all these things which make life sound pretty depressing. But that was obviously their way of looking at it. But as you might have guessed, things weren't like this in the Golden Age, which was just after the Titan Prometheus created man. And these men, and they were just men, no women at that time, they wanted nothing. They didn't have to work, they didn't have to do anything except basically exist just to worship the gods of Olympus. And to ensure they didn't advance beyond this role, Zeus hid fire so that they couldn't cook, they couldn't see at night, they couldn't keep warm, and all these things that eventually lead to the concept of what we think of as civilization. But feeling pity for them, Prometheus stole the fire and gifted it to man. And that's where Pandora comes in that Zeus created Pandora, or ordered her to be created, as the first woman to be, a quote, a beautiful evil. And lots of the other gods gifted her attributes like her beauty from Aphrodite and her cunning and her curiosity. And then she was sent to marry Prometheus's brother, and as a wedding gift, she was given the jar. And she was told, obviously, not to open it, even though she'd basically been genetically engineered to ensure that she did open it and bring about the misery onto mankind as punishment. So even though there's this perception of her as a source of evil and temptation, certainly within a hierarchical, sort of patriarchal ancient Greek society, Pandora is, to me, as much a vessel of the god's vengeance as the jar itself.
So almost like a warning, a tragic figure in some kind of Shakespearean sort of play, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, very Shakespearean about it, yeah.
No, that's fascinating. And I like that, as you say, that she wasn't just, she wasn't doing it in a sort of silly sense. It wasn't a mistake. You know, she was sort of destined to do this thing and created to do this thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very much contrived from inception, to bring about the downfall. Not so much the downfall, but to bring about the punishment of mankind. Yeah,
fascinating. And the land of Hesperides, am I saying that right?
Yeah, the Hesperides. Yes, that's right. Yep.
That's central to the research and central to the book as well. And for people who haven't come across it like myself, what is the land of Hesperides? And why did the ancient Greeks believe it was a real place? Or did they believe it was a real place at all? Is it a fictional sort of thing, a cautionary story or something like that? I'm thinking of the comparison between sort of the Garden of Eden here.
Yeah. Well, the land of the Hesperides, it was the ancient Greek concept of a mythical paradise. And to them, it existed at the extreme western edge of the known world, right where the sun sets into the cosmic ocean. And that's quite similar to things like ancient Egyptian mythology and cosmology, where the sun sets in the west on the western bank of the Nile. That's where the dead goes and all this sort of stuff. So there's lots of links there to the concept of the West. And lots of other ancient cultures viewed the West in the same way as the twilight zone between the mortal realm and the divine. And it was a magical place. And most importantly, it was a place that mortals couldn't easily reach. In some cultures, you had to be dead to go there. Some places you had to be divine to go there. So it was a really sort of special place to them. But the name, the Hesperides, is actually what they call not so much the landmass themselves, but it was the group of nymphs, these beautiful nymphs who lived there, and they were the daughters of the Titan Atlas, who's the guy who holds the sky on his shoulder in mythology. And they were tasked with tending a sacred walled garden containing a magical apple tree. And this tree belonged to Hera, who was Zeus's wife and the queen of the gods. And it had pure golden apples that were said to grant immortality. And more importantly, that the tree was guarded night and day by a never sleeping 100-headed dragon called Ladon. And because he had 100 heads, there was always some of them awake and keeping guard, so no one could get past this guy. But did the Greeks sort of genuinely think it was a physical place? Well, yes, they did. They actually thought it had a physical geographic location. It wasn't just this sort of fluffy idea sort of out there in the wild. But its rumoured location sort of kept shifting as ancient Greeks started sailing further and further from the islands and from the mainland Greece, further into the Western Mediterranean. So first they placed it in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains, hence the link to Atlas, and that's in modern-day Morocco. And then it kind of got moved to just beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, which the ancients called the Pillars of Heracles. And eventually sort of it moved further out into the Atlantic Ocean itself. And there's this really sort of fascinating theory that the legendary golden apples are actually a distorted traveller's tale of regular oranges from far-flung sort of lands like Tenerife and the Canaries that sort of came back, got warped in retellings about how amazing they were into the idea of the golden apples.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And I love that, because the Pillars of Heracles is links to Plato's Atlantis legend, doesn't it? And the idea that they're beyond the pillars, and that's where you'll find it. But I suppose what we're dealing with here is the way these sorts of cultures connect to one another, and there are links throughout history with all sorts of different things. They're almost like they've got a sort of joint mythology that has become sort of individualized over time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, sort of this whole idea of the Western Isles existing out there, sort of beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That's echoed through the sort of Roman mythology, where they had the blessed Isles, and they sent expeditions out to try and find them, or the Fortunate Isles that they were also called. Then obviously sort of the Romans have lots of deep connections to Greek mythology. So whether that was continuation of the Greek idea of the land of the Hesperides or something completely different, I don't know. But it seems very striking that they have these two very similar myths going on there. And even in later sort of Celtic and Arthurian lore, you get the island of Avalon. And that again is explicitly, even though lots of people associate it now with places like Glastonbury, the original tellings actually say it was a Western paradise of healing and immortality. And its name actually translates, I think the original Welsh name translates to the island of the apples. So you kind of wonder again, this idea of apples on a Western paradise. And sort of most striking really is like that resemblance between, to me anyway, between the land of the Hesperides and the biblical Garden of Eden.
Yes, I was talking to David Roll on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how he believes, and this is what he said, and I think he's got some good things, that he traced the Garden of Eden to a specific place, a valley in northern Iran, I think it was. And he was talking all about how it links in all these different ways, various rivers and particular soil content and all of these things that link to that place. And so the fact that these have got some kind of backing in the way that you talked there about apples and oranges, and there are these clues, aren't there? These sort of breadcrumbs that we can pick up today to decide, to theorize as to whether these were fictional places or whether they're actually real points on the world that we can visit today, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I actually read a few of David's books years ago. Yeah. Legend, I think, was the one talking about Genesis, and another one, Time of the Kings or something, I think it was called. But I mean, they're fantastic because they really go into that comparative, I don't know if they class it as comparative mythology or archaeology, but and he sort of delves into the real world locations and the explanations for things found in the Bible, I think, isn't it? It is very, very biblical, I believe. It is where he studies. And that's exactly where I was sort of kind of going with the Olympus Vendetta. Once I sort of came across this idea of the land of the Hesperides, and automatically I just thought of the Garden of Eden and how similar they were, because they both feature a pristine, sacred garden, both sort of these extreme borders of the known world. Both of them have got your tree with your forbidden, life-giving or immortality-giving fruit at the center of the story. They've both got like a serpentine antagonist, say, sort of guarding it, like Ladon in the Greek stories, or Satan in Genesis. And that they're both protected by these divine figures. Like in Greece, it's the Hesperides nymphs. In the Bible, it's the what they call the cherubs, the cherubim. And they're there to protect this garden from anyone else. And then obviously, the story of Eden, features the Eve character, who's very similar in some ways to the Pandora character, even though Pandora doesn't actually feature in the Land of the Hesperides stories. I still sort of saw there's sort of a syncretism there, there's a link between the two.
Yeah, and I suppose we have to mention Heracles, which is the Greek version, but we would know this In the Roman term, Hercules, right? That's the sort of delineation, the connection between those two characters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so yeah, Hercules is the very much the Roman sort of version of the name that's become more popularized. But yeah, it was Heracles to the ancient Greeks, and obviously what I love about Heracles is that everyone even today sort of knows something about Hercules. Even if it's just that he was super strong and had big muscles, or that he completed these 12 seemingly impossible labors, even if you don't know what the labors are, you still know, again, a bit like that Pandora's box type thing. It's just become part of your colloquial sort of language, isn't it? But I mean, yeah, I love the Heracles stories, and I grew up just reading all the myths and legends of not just Heracles, but all the Greek gods and the heroes. And that's what's nice about the Greek mythology is you've got your gods and you've got your heroes, and they're quite two separate sort of entities going on there, and they have these clashes between them. And the gods they're just not nice people. It's not like, some of the Egyptian stories are very much focused just on the gods, and the Norse, again, they're very much focused on the gods. But in ancient Greek sort of mythology, you have the gods and the humans and the heroes, and they're all interacting and they're all muddled together. And yeah, that's what I think so fascinating about it. And it's kind of come full circle for me, because I grew up reading all these stories of these incredible exploits about Heracles, and now I read them with my sons. Well, we sit down, very often. We've read through quite a few books. Heracles is definitely their favourite. Some of what stimulated me wanting to bring him into one of my Jackson Rain stories, of what he just makes as this great ancient figure that everyone knows something about, but maybe not a huge amount. But yeah, I sort of struggled to know where to start with that. But yeah, I love Heracles.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And do the sources all agree on these characters, or are they are there different interpretations of the same things?
Yeah, there's loads of different interpretations. There's loads of different versions of the same stories. Like, with Heracles, for instance, some of the labors are in different orders. So what I particularly like about Heracles is he pops up all over the place, and I sort of quite often think of the sort of Greek mythology a bit like a Bronze Age. I call it like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because you've got all these different characters, all these different heroes, and they've all got their own unique stories, but they're always popping up in each other's stories, or here, there, and everywhere. And Heracles, for instance, has a really big role to play in Jason and the Argonauts. And that's led to lots of discussion about where in Heracles' life the various tasks take place. And there's quite an accepted order, but there's quite a few different interpretations, because, Labor 6 couldn't have happened if he'd been with the Argonauts at that time, because the Argonauts at that time were, fighting against, Dia's father in the far side of the world, or against the Amazons. And yeah, I mean, they sort of delve into different aspects of the personalities. Sometimes they're portrayed as quite unpleasant characters, sometimes, whereas other times they're, your dashing heroes. And again, it's very, very patriarchal. There's not that many strong female characters. But that said, there are quite a few, mainly the gods, like Hera and Artemis, and some of the characters like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting world to think about, and much like the Pandora's box, I feel like once you sort of know a little bit, you want to go further in. There's always more to know, and different interpretations to sort of bring to bring back about those things.
And there's all these links as well that, and sometimes they're not really obvious. So yeah, going back to good old Heracles again, when I started coming up with this idea, I'd had this idea about the land of the Hesperides and Eden, this idea of and an interpretation of her with Eve. But I also wanted to bring in Heracles. And, as a writer, as sometimes you could look at something and think, I'm just shoehorning a character in for the sake of it there. And then all of a sudden I stumbled upon this fact that Heracles actually has a biological link to Pandora, in that he married Pandora's, I think it was her granddaughter, Deianira, who was Heracles' final wife, who ended up actually accidentally killing him. So she got quite an important role to play. Gave him a tunic soaked in Centaur venom, which basically set his skin on fire, and that's how Heracles meets his doom, sadly, at the end, because she thinks he's running off with another woman, and this tunic will make him stay in love with her. So it's another one of those those tales, or they quite often end in a sad way. Some of these Greek tales, don't they? Yeah, Greek tragedies, literally. But yeah, so he married Pandora's granddaughter, and they had a child which he called Pandei, I believe her name was. So he actually fathered one of Pandora's direct descendants. Once I found that, I thought that's that just works perfectly with sort of linking it all together, justifying why Heracles is involved with a Pandora story. And of course, Heracles is also the character who, in the Greek myths, I think it's his 11th labour, as most people accept it. He's the one who actually travels to the land of the Hesperides, and he's the only one who's successful in stealing one of these golden apples from Hera's tree. And he does that through sort of tricking Atlas. Heracles takes the sky from Atlas, and he holds the sky on his shoulders. And, being Heracles, he's the only guy in the world strong enough to do this. And while he does that, Atlas wanders into the land of the Hesperides, takes an apple, brings it back. He tries to do over Heracles by leaving him to hold the sky forever. And Heracles just manages to manipulate the situation again, says, oh, hey, hang on, just hold it just 1 second while I just readjust these pads on my shoulders, because, eternity's kind of a long time to be holding the sky. He does it. Heracles gets the apple and says sayonara, and he heads off and lives happily ever after till he burns to death with a, poisoned robe anyway, and leaving Atlas behind. So again, there's that link there between Heracles and the land of the Hesperides.
I like that. And I wonder how many modern storytellers have been inspired by, I mean, it's not a question you can answer, I suppose, have been inspired by these stories, because they are tales that are very modern in the way that you're using intelligence rather than brawn. You're using there are sort of modern lessons, aren't there, in these thousand-year-old tales,
Yeah, that's right. And with Heracles, like, what I find really fascinating is that the image of him is always this muscle-bound, gruntish sort of hero, who's so strong, the world's strongest man, greatest warrior and all this sort of stuff. But actually, I'm retelling some of the stories through my newsletter on a weekly basis, but with a bit of a gangster slant to tie into my novel themes. And actually, as I'm going through it, I become more and more fascinated by how very rarely does Heracles find a solution that's just about using, his gruntish nature. He's got a head on his shoulders. He's always thinking through and using cunning and deception to sort of solve these seemingly impossible labours. So again, like you say, it's about almost getting people to think, which I guess would probably be quite significant to the man's world of sort of Bronze and Iron Age Greece, where it was all about the warrior men going into battle and that sort of stuff. Perhaps it's sort of a bit symbolic of this shift towards, philosophy of the classical Greek era, perhaps. That's just conjecture.
No, I think you're right. And you talk about a patriarchal society, you've mentioned that before, but these are traits that aren't typically patriarchal. It's not about it's about using, as you say, creativity and trying to get this in the way that isn't totally brutish, that you sort of associate with that sort of way of thinking,
Yeah, precisely.
Fascinating. Yeah, really interesting twist to it. And you talk also about the Temple of Artemis, and this keeps appearing in mythology. It appears in the Olympus Vendetta. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Artemis herself is a very fascinating figure. What's that connection, and what is the Temple of Artemis, and where would we find it today, if even that is a possible thing?
Yeah, so the Temple of Artemis is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but unfortunately you can't visit it today because, like all but one of the 7 wonders, which being the Great Pyramid, the only one still standing, it was destroyed in antiquity. So there's nothing much left to see, but it was at the site of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, which I think back then was classed as Anatolia, but I'm not wrong on that. But yeah, Artemis herself, she's a really complex Olympian god, whereas some of the others are fairly straightforward. She's got a lot of sort of duality to her role, and she's a fiercely independent goddess of the wilderness and the wild hunt, and she becomes linked to the moon. So originally Selene is considered the moon goddess, but actually Artemis kind of takes on that role during some of the later Greek myths. But her sort of core societal role, if you like, was as the ultimate protector of women and young girls in childbirth. If you were a woman in ancient Greece, Artemis was the deity you turned to for sanctuary and for strength. There's no direct mythological connections that I found between Pandora and Artemis, but while I was sort of researching for the book, it just seemed really natural to me that the first woman ever created, and the woman who is sort of personally and sort of by default, all of her descendants are all tarred by this brush of being the person who unleashed evil on mankind. I just kind of feel like she would fall under Artemis's protection somewhere down the line. And the temple of Artemis itself, according to the ancient sources, it was this architectural marvel. It was 4 times bigger than the Athenian Parthenon that still stands in Athens today. And it was the first temple to be constructed entirely out of marble. And it had 127 colossal columns that were over 60 feet tall. So it's
Wow.
this really striking visual thing that I really wanted to include in the Valhalla Key. Sorry, no, in the Olympus Vendetta, apologies. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's a fantastic thing to show there, but obviously it got destroyed. So I've done a bit of a jiggery with how that appears in the book, based in sort of 1940. But the important thing about the Temple of Artemis is that it was literally a place of what's called cilia, which is the ancient origin of a modern word, asylum. So it had this right of sanctuary that was legally protected anyone within its sacred boundaries, but women in particular. It protected them from arrest, from violence, from civic law, and women would flee there from all over Greece and all over the known world. According to legend, even the famous warrior women, the Amazons, they sought refuge there while fleeing from the wrath of Dionysus. And it was overseen by, for that point in history, a really unique matriarchal religious hierarchy. And it was actually modeled after the construction of a beehive, where Artemis reigned as the supreme queen bee. So it was very much, I wanted to include her to bring in this protection for women, links to Pandora.
Fantastic. That's so interesting. And that's sort of your antithesis to the patriarchal thing, isn't it? This idea of this microcosm of society where it sort of flips that on its head and sees that in a different way. I always feel disappointed about these 7 wonders of the ancient world that I'd love to go and see today. And it must be wonderful to be able to create them in literature, to bring them back in the way that you can imagine them,
Yeah, definitely. The other sort of thing I included, so when we were traveling in Rhodes a few years ago, and we went to Mandrake Harbour, which is where the Colossus of Rhodes once stood. And I mean, now obviously that was destroyed in an earthquake in something like 27 BC. But again, I could just picture it, as we were sailing through on I think we was on a ferry and then a little guide boat. And I could just kind of picture this massive statue made of bronze standing over the harbour. And I thought, again, I want to include that in a book. So I managed to wangle that into the story as well in a bit of a roundabout way. So yeah, like you say, it's those real striking visual elements. Like when I'm writing those bits, I would kind of put myself into picturing it almost like a Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings type books, when you're looking at these big sweeping shots of these giant colossal things that you just can't see anymore.
Yeah, I know. I can imagine that, and I love doing that myself. I find that really interesting and sort of pulling that into the story in the way that you can. Let's go back to Pandora again and think about her story with fresh eyes. With what we've talked about today, how she's a complex character, how she's set up to fail almost. What is the story there? What's that myth trying to tell us? Do you think it's got is it got a morality sort of lesson? Is there a sort of warning in there? Is there a reason or something we could learn from that story, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said earlier, there's almost this perception of her as this sappy character, but she's not. She's very much the victim of the story. And she's kind of like the ultimate historical scapegoat. And so the whole myth about Pandora, it was heavily popularized by Hesiod around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which was a real life period where there was this massive social upheaval across the Mediterranean. It coincided with things like the fall of the Minoan culture on Crete and the destruction of the Mycenaean culture in mainland Greece. But there was also things like the attacks of the sea people against Egypt during the reign of, I think it's Ramesses III, and There's so many things are all going on in this period. The eruption of Thera was around about that sort of period, give or take a few hundred years. So there was a lot going on as the Bronze Age was collapsing. It wasn't like an overnight thing, obviously, but there was this big societal shift from egalitarian goddess worshipping cultures like the Minoans, who were very, very heavily focused on female idols, and it was shifted to this very rigid patriarchal system, and it was dominated by your elite male warriors. And I think, and lots of people seem to sort of agree with this while I've been researching the book, that men were looking for a narrative to justify sort of stripping women of their societal power. And Pandora was invented to do exactly that. The message, I think, is pretty clear. It was like, look what happens when a woman is left in charge of something important. She ruins paradise. And the same like anxieties played out in the founding myth of Athens, where legend there says there was a contest between Athena and Poseidon to see who would patronize the city. And all the women of Athens voted for Athena, all the men voted for Poseidon, but because there was one more woman, Athena won. Poseidon was a bit, ticked off about this, so he started slamming his weight around, throwing a few tsunamis, a few earthquakes, just having a bit of a paddy. And so the men of Athens ended up stripping the women of their right to vote. They decreed that no child could ever bear their mother's name again to appease Poseidon. And so again, it's a fairly similar sort of story there of men shifting the blame for what was going on in the world all to the women. And that's where like that Artemis thing comes into it again. So, I think that's really what the ancient Greeks were doing. Myths like Pandora and the Vote of Athens, they weren't just like fun bedtime stories. They were deliberate structural tools that were used to justify the subjugation of women and to explain the collapse of civilizations. And yeah, in my book, I kind of treat Pandora not as the source of evil, but as the victim of the world's sort of like the ultimate propaganda campaign.
Yes. And it is exactly that, as you said, a propaganda campaign based on someone who's got a specific aim. They want to achieve something, so they set up this thing that has a certain result that makes people feel and think in a certain way. And that's fascinating and a really interesting way to think about it, right? Because we think about these stories as sort of historical as opposed to written for a purpose.
Yeah, that's right. And it's only really in very recent years, decades at best, that agency of women has sort of begun to be examined more as different sort of feminist movements, and not so much movements, but interpretations of these old sources that have always been interpreted by men, that they're starting to come to the fore more. And so it's starting to give the women agency, and they're no longer just the scapegoats, or they are the scapegoats, but it's now been recognized that that's what they were, as opposed to, for thousands of years, it's just been, they messed everything up. And that gives men the right to rule the world, kind of, is the core element of the story.
Yeah, fascinating and so interesting, because it's showing the importance of storytelling, right? People can think that stories are just for entertainment. We're both writers; we write stories for entertainment, but of course they're more than that. They are doing this. You are perpetrating a narrative, not just of the characters in the book, but of your worldview and your understanding of things, and that's a real important job to have, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So I've had to change this final question because you've been on the podcast before, which,
Sure.
and I'm going to make it sort of focus it a little bit more on what we've been talking about today, because you mentioned earlier, and I love that idea, that you were interested in these legends and myths as a young boy, and now you've got sons and you're sort of imparting that interest on them. But what specific stories, or what part of this, of this whole fascinating world first sparked your interest in it and first sort of led you down this path to begin with?
So my earliest memories of like the Greek myths is very much the old stop motion movies of like Clash of the Titans and Jason and the Argonauts. The ones with the skeletons that come to life, and the big lizards, a bit like the old Land That Time Forgot type thing with where they use an iguana to be a T-Rex and that sort of stuff. So it's made in the 60s or something like that. And they're so cheesy and corny by today's standards. But I remember watching them with my parents when I was young. And even though the special effects are something to be desired, unless you're really into, proper aficionado of stop motion, then it's just the stories there that, you cut through the special effects, you cut through the fantastical elements, and you've got these stories of adventurers. And they were, they were going out, like Jason and the Argonauts in particular. The route, if you actually plot his route, which I did a while back, just for fun, really, just because I got quite interested in Jason's story, and I was trying to work out where he went, and plotting it all around the Mediterranean and up into sort of modern sort of Germany and those sort of areas, and then down. They end up going to the land of the Hesperides, actually, which they base in Morocco. And so, yeah, it's this idea of adventure, and it's the old school sort of adventure where you go out into the wilderness and there's no help. They didn't have, fleets coming in to help save the day. That was just Jason and his band of Argonauts. And, they're very much my earliest memories of them. And then I remember reading, there's a series of books by the Hesperides brothers, who are two Greek brothers. And I think one of them wrote the books and one of them did some illustrations for them. And they've been translated into English. And they were written for children, but like a lot of ancient Greek stuff, some of the subject matter by today's standards, you think, it's a bit R-rated for a child's book.
Yeah,
I've had to trip over those bits when retelling them to our sons. But they literally... I think there's about 9 books in this series, and they go from the creation of the gods and the battle with the Titans right through to when humans stopped worshipping the gods, and tells the stories of Heracles and Jason and Achilles and Troy and all these great things there. And yeah, my boys, they love them. Well, my eldest one, I've read quite a few of those books too. My youngest one definitely will be reading them too in the not too distant future. They reenact the stories now, which is obviously my fault. We've travelled around Greece a bit over the last few years, and they're just infatuated with the stories, probably even more than I am, actually. And they have like some of their Playmobil stuff. They got like a model of the Argo, and they send it off on these adventures, replicating these stories that I tell them. So, and I think that's really fantastic when you think in 2026, lots of people, I imagine, not just me, are sitting around telling their children the exact same stories that was told 3,000, 4,000 years ago, possibly even earlier than that.
Yes. And I love that you can have that. As a child, you can see this story in one sense, but yet when you dip into it now as an adult, you can see it in a slightly different way. Like, there are different levels, there are different layers of meaning within the story that you can interpret or that you can understand, dependent on how much you know and your worldview and these sorts of things. And that's a true story. That's a lovely bit of that's a true test of a story, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, it is. Yeah. To have all those layers to peel back and be interpreted in lots of different ways. Yeah. The goal of every storyteller, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, James, tell us about the Olympus Vendetta.
Okay, so the Olympus Vendetta, like you said earlier, Jackson Rain, who's a PI in 19... Well, there's a crossover between 1939 and 1940 in New York, and he gets involved with a complex array of mysteries linked to some girls that are going missing, which leads him on this adventure that ends up in Greece. Well, it doesn't end up in Greece, actually. A big chunk of it takes place in Greece. And it ties in, the idea of Pandora and Adam and Eve. We visit places like Patmos, which is where the Cave of the Apocalypse is, where the Book of Revelation was written. And we've got the villains. You've got your Nazis in there, the same as the Valhalla Key, which was the first one. But we also introduced the Inquisition, which is a continuation of the Spanish Inquisition with their very fanatical views and wanting to take control of this story before Jack can reveal it. We've got the story of Pandora intersecting with Heracles. And one of my favourite things about it was just really writing the places I've been to sort of fairly recently, like Telendos, which is this little island just off the coast of Kylimnos. And it's just one of those little places, and I'm sure you've done this as well, Luke, where I visited it and I just fell in love with it. And I thought, that's got to go in the book. It's just ideal for it. Yeah. And it's a good old-fashioned adventure with lots of action, lots of humour, hopefully, lots of daring do, and hopefully a lot of heart is how I like to think of it. So a lot going on in it. But at the core of it, it's there for having a good time, to escape, some of the pressures of the modern world, to sit down on the beach or in your favourite armchair and really jump into.
Love it. James, that's wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So fascinating, and a reminder there, I think, about the power of stories. As a writer myself, I love to think about stories being more than just entertainment, right? And maybe that's my own sort of self-importance speaking, that seems to be so true in our conversation there. You can think about Pandora's story in the idea of this sort of cautionary tale, right? This fun thing to share, to share like a just a bit of entertainment, but yet, like James and I did there, you can unpack it and talk about sort of the patriarchal society and the criticism of that and all of these things, and how your perceptions of that can change over time. Really, really fascinating thing. So James's books are available wherever books are sold. The first one in the series is the Valhalla Key. The second one, which we were talking about today, is the Olympus Vendetta. You can read them out of order should you want. They are sort of self-contained mysteries, but always reading in a series to get the full experience. I think start with the beginning and move on forwards. That's how I would recommend it anyway. As always, thank you so much for hanging out today. It's been wonderful to spend some time with you. If you've enjoyed the show, please like, please subscribe, and please share. It takes just seconds, but really does help me spread the word about this show. And if you need some more adventure in your life, and let's be honest, who doesn't, you might like to join the Adventure Society. This is your invitation to join my weekly newsletter. It's your ticket to travel with me, to share my real world adventures and find out first when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. There's a link, as always, in the show notes. And if you're a fan of adventure stories like the one we've talked about today, I would love for you to check out my books. LukeRichardsonAuthor.com is where you need to go. And of course, there's a link in the show notes there too. Bon voyage. Thank you so much. Enjoy the adventure, and I'll see you next time.